Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Immersion workshop on the NIH data management and sharing policy. So this policy has already gone into effect, but hopefully will impart some wisdom to you so you can work on this at your institution. I did want to mention we have closed captioning available from speakers if you use that option in Zoom, and you can also turn that off if you don't want to see that. So we are the National Center for Data Services, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what we are and what we do before we launch into the policy. So we are a part of the network of the National Library of Medicine, which is comprised of 7 regions across the US, 4 offices and 4 centers. And our goal is to basically educate and promote the National Library of Medicine, which is the world's largest biomedical library and is a part of the National Institutes of Health. So we promote a lot of the resources that they have available there and talk to a lot of medical librarians across the country and researchers and staff at institutions that are working on things such as the policy and data services specifically for us. So for us, that means research data management. We have a class in that, and data science. We're building a class in that, and we do a lot of other webinars and educational materials and online resources. So we have beginner training for people who are new to these areas and to get opportunities to learn about different areas in data services. We have further development for people who are already a little bit trained and looking for additional support. And we have resources that we generate online, such as a data glossary that's available for terms used in data services, and a toolkit we have for the policy that we'll mention today as well, which is a bunch of different resources from different areas that help people address the policy at their institutions. Who we are, so we are based out of NYU's Health Sciences Library, and this is our current roster. We actually have 2 full-time people, which is Peace and myself, on this National Center for Data Services, and others are part-time working with us. So Elisa is our director, Debbie is our administrator, and we have content experts with Fred, Genevieve, and Nicole, and Nina Exner is our ambassador who works in a lot of different groups and gets us information that's current and feedback from what we're doing, and then also helps promote our activities to other groups. And joining us today are other members of the NNLM and NIH, including Lisa Federer, Christine Neiman, and Elizabeth Roth, who are also data specialists, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves more fully during their segments. But basically, we're very glad to have their help today to work out these materials and deliver them to you and give some different perspectives based on what they've been doing. So our learning objectives are that by the end of this workshop, you should be able to communicate this policy in language that people can understand. So researchers that you're working with, other librarians that you may want to help train on the policy, and speaking with leadership will be a portion that we talk about too. It's important to share expectations and goals and sort of limitations on what you can do for the policy at your institution. We'd also like you to be able to provide guidance for researchers on how they approach different sections of the policy and creating data management plans. So we'll break down each section and give you the terminology associated with it. So hopefully you can gain expertise in sort of how to talk and guide people through the policy and preparing data management plans. We'll also have an activity where you critique a data management plan so that you can better understand what goes into a plan and what fits in with the policy. So we would like you to be able to critique something after this workshop that was written, generated by a researcher, and you can give feedback and sort of list, what they did well and what they might be missing in their data management plan. So we are dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience throughout this workshop and all of our events. So for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, age, or religion, we do not tolerate harassment in any form. If you're concerned about anything that happens today, please email us at ncds@nnlm.gov. I wanted to share the breakdown of what we'll be doing today. We have a mixture of presentations and breakout sessions where you'll be able to work on something and discuss with a smaller group, and we will have breaks built in as well. So after this introduction, we'll have a policy overview, just to give a quick overview of what's going on with the policy and how libraries fit into that and the history of the policy and stuff like that. Then we'll talk about library roles and what we can be doing from the library's perspective. We'll go into some RDM basics, which are necessary to sort of understand what's happening with the policy. And then we'll have a breakout session and a break. After that, data types, related tools, and standards are different sections of the policy that we're going to break down bit by bit. And then at 2:50 Eastern time, we'll have another breakout session and then our longer break at 2:30. And then we'll go into some more sections. And then the final break will be at 3:50. The data management plan critique is at 4, and then we'll talk about how to talk to researchers with a live interview with a researcher at 4:30. And then we'll wrap up. We'll have the survey at the end that will provide a code for MLA continuing education credits. So you can all put in for those, and we'll talk about other resources that you can use for the policy. So without further ado, I will hand off to Lisa to talk about the policy overview.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name's Lisa Federer. Oh, we lost the slides, I think. Should I share them myself?
Yeah, if you could, that would help with the timing.
Sorry, I've given many talks this week.
Can jump back in and read it.
Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, hopefully.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So my name's Lisa Federer. I'm the acting director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives at the National Library of Medicine, and I'm going to give a brief overview of the policy and some resources related to that. So like I said, a little background to the policy, briefly discuss what goes into a data management and sharing plan, and some resources. So I wanted to start with a brief history of data sharing at NIH. This is not the first time NIH has undertaken a policy activity in this kind of area. NIH, the mission is to seek knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems, and how that can be applied to enhancing health and reducing illness and disability. And NIH recognizes that data sharing is an essential part of doing that. So NIH has had a long-standing policy that the results and accomplishments of the activities of those funds should be made available to the research community and the public at large. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to briefly touch on a few highlights from the last 2 decades related to data sharing. NIH instituted a policy in 2003 for data sharing that applied only to grants receiving a threshold of money. I believe $500,000 was the threshold there. And so it did not apply to all NIH grants. Only about 25% of grants met that threshold. That policy has now been replaced by the policy that we'll be talking about today. You might also be familiar with the 2008 NIH public access policy, which requires that researchers deposit a copy of manuscript that comes out of NIH funding into PubMed Central. You may also have heard about the Nelson memo that came out last fall that is updating or asking agencies to update and come up with new policies that are similar to the public access policy, except the current policy allows for up to a year embargo, and the Nelson memo calls for immediate release of the manuscript. So be on the lookout for an announcement coming from NIH soon about the new policy in response to that memo. I'll also mention just briefly the 2014 genomic data sharing policy. This was a policy, or is a policy still in effect, that applies to human and non-human genomic data. And it is a little bit more prescriptive in where data should be shared than the policy we'll be talking about today, because it does apply to just a specific kind of data. And this policy, as I said, is still in effect. And they have done some work to align it with the data management and sharing policy that we'll be discussing today. So let's get into it. The scope of this policy is that it applies to all research that NIH is funding in whole or in part that generates scientific data. This includes extramural grants and contracts that are being sent out to fund people at institutions around the US and around the world. And it also applies to intramural research projects. About 80% of NIH's funding goes out in the form of grants and contracts, but about 20% is used for research that is conducted at the NIH here in Bethesda and a couple of other places around the country. And this applies to those researchers as well. What this does not apply to is funding that doesn't generate data. So things like training grants or infrastructure grants, conference grants that aren't developing data, of course, no data to share, so they don't have to worry about this policy. The policy requires two things. One is the submission of a data management and sharing plan that outlines how data and accompanying metadata will be managed and shared, as well as identifying any potential restrictions or limitations to sharing of that data, which we'll talk about. And the second piece of that is compliance with the plan as approved by the NIH Institute Center or Office, which is what ICO stands for. So the plan will be approved, and then it is expected that the grantee or awardee will carry out that plan. There are 6 sections or elements of a data management and sharing plan, which I'm going to very briefly talk about here and will dig much more into over the course of today. So the first is a description of the data and metadata and documentation, tools, software, and code, standards for the data and metadata, timelines for how long and when data will be preserved and accessible, considerations for access, distribution, and reuse, and then finally oversight of data management and sharing, who will ensure that the plan is carried out. So the data description will involve a description of the type and amount of data that is going to be collected or used, and as well what data will be shared, including rationale for data that are not shared, which we'll talk a little bit more about. As well as a description of what metadata and documentation will be shared. So things like what metadata standards will be used, how crucial documentation like code books or study protocols will be shared. So question of what counts as data for sharing. What should be shared is adequate data to validate and replicate the study findings. And it should include data that results from the study but doesn't necessarily support a publication. So if there is a scenario where research is conducted and there are null findings that don't result in a publication, those data should still be expected to be shared. What does not count as data for sharing is anything that's not the final scientific research data. So things like lab notebooks or preliminary analyses, completed case report forms from working with participants, communications, and also physical objects. So this only applies to digital scientific data. Things like biospecimens do not fall under this policy. There are acceptable reasons not to share. Things such as where there is limitations on sharing through informed consent. So it's important if research or data from human subjects is going to be shared, that those participants have been informed about that and consent to that. So in a case where that has not happened, such as if you're continuing a project that had started before and did not plan to share the data, that that consent would have to be respected, and those data would not be shared. There's also situations where even with de-identifying the data, the risk of re-identification is such that there is the potential that people involved could suffer harm. And of course, in that case, it is not appropriate to share that data. Also, where there is explicit federal, state, local, or tribal law, regulation, or policy that prohibits disclosure. HIPAA could come into play in some cases, and data sets that cannot practically be digitized with reasonable efforts. So if this is non-digital data, that it is not practical to digitize it, that would be an acceptable limitation. So I'm going to quickly go through the other areas and just mention, again, we'll get a lot more in depth into this. The second area is the tools, software, and code. So what is it that you would need to access or use that data? Standards that are associated with the data. So things like data dictionaries, controlled vocabularies that are being used, common data elements, which are standardized ways of defining and answering variables, identifiers, and when no consensus standard exists in a discipline, noting that as well. Next is the timeline of when data will be made available and for how long. There's no prescription about how long data should be made available. That can differ from one discipline to another. But the expectation is that data will be shared no later than the time of publication of articles associated with the data or the end of the period of performance, whichever comes first. Next is access, distribution, and reuse considerations. So things like addressing how informed consent will be obtained to allow for sharing and what privacy and confidentiality protections are in place. So for example, it might be necessary to place data in a controlled access repository rather than an open repository that anyone can get to. And then finally, oversight of data management and sharing, which is essentially who will be responsible for carrying out oversight to ensure that compliance with the plan happens. So how this workflow kind of goes, a plan is submitted with the application for funding, and a budget justification is included in that as well. Peer reviewers can comment on but not score the budget, but the plan itself will be assessed by NIH program staff. And they will work with the grantee to make sure that the plan is acceptable. Plans can be updated, things can change. So for example, maybe a new spiffy repository has come out that you want to use instead. And so that is certainly something that can be updated in collaboration with the program officer. The plan does become incorporated into the terms and conditions of the grant, and it will be monitored at regular reporting intervals. So this how they're doing the plan will be part of what is reported back to NIH. And compliance is a factor into, or can be a factor into future funding decisions, not just for the individual researcher, but for the institution as a whole. This is the minimum requirement for NIH. There are other policies that may apply, and my best guidance is to, when in doubt, ask the program officer about what is expected for a particular funding opportunity. Now, I just really briefly want to talk about some resources for writing a data management and sharing plan. One thing to note is that people can ask for funds to carry out the activities in their plan. So there are a set of allowable costs that you can include in your budget. Some people who are doing this for the first time may not really know, like, how much does it cost to preserve or to archive data? So one resource that is available is this study that was funded by the National Library of Medicine from the National Academies that looked at developing a framework for forecasting long-term costs for data. So I'm gonna not get into the details of that, but if you're interested, you can check it out. And they also have this checklist for administrators at research institutions, but I think it would also be really helpful for librarians to think about how to get people thinking about these sorts of things at their institution. Briefly, I want to talk about repositories. This can be a tricky area for some researchers who, again, have not had to share data before. Where do I share it? There's a very broad and complex data ecosystem. And so this can be tricky to navigate. NIH does encourage the use of subject-specific data repositories when those are available, but there's not always a natural home for data in a subject-specific repository. So some other options that exist are PubMed Central for smaller data sets associated with a publication, generalist repositories, which will accept data sets regardless of the topic or the data type. And then Strides is the cloud platform or cloud program for NIH, and that can be used for large and high priority data sets. If you're looking for where to find one of those subject-specific repositories, one resource is the page that's maintained by the Biomedical Informatics Coordinating Committee of NIH, BMIC, and that contains a list of those repositories. I'll also just briefly mention GRAY, the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, which is a funding activity that NIH undertook about a year ago. And this has brought together generalist repositories to work together on implementing consistent capabilities and basically making it easier for people to share and find NIH-funded data. I won't go through all of this, but basically these are some of the objectives that Gray had in mind to help improve this generalist repository ecosystem. And this is the list of the 7 repositories that are involved, and all are good options for a generalist repository. I will also briefly mention the repository desirable characteristics for repositories. This is a set of 10 desirable characteristics that can help to evaluate a repository. So if you're looking at a repository and wondering, is this a good repository for me to use? These are some criteria that could be useful to think about, plus an additional 9 criteria for repositories that house human data. So I will stop there and hand it to, I believe, Nicole.
Hello. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. All right, just one moment. All right, can you see what we're looking at?
Yep.
Thank you, Justin. All right. So I'm going to talk about potential library roles within the new policy. And I've sort of set this up as the amount of FTE and the level of data expertise in your library and different services you can offer based on that. We know not everybody is coming with the same amount of resources. So we're going to go through these basically from the most, what we feel like is the most achievable to the areas that would require the most expertise and time. So we're going to start off with outreach. So when I say outreach, just to be perfectly clear about what I mean ensuring that researchers and librarians know about this policy change. And this could include in-person outreach, so perhaps short presentations at faculty meetings, or online outreach, like notices on the library's webpage or other places on your institution's web presence. So an example of some of the work we've done at NYU Langone Health is we worked with the institution's communications team to include notices about the policy change across the institution's web presence on the grant application platform, as well as in relevant newsletters and listservs at different departments across the institution. Now, going further along in the amount of time required to participate or to support these sorts of activities is education. And this is ensuring that researchers and librarians know how to comply with the policy. So not just that the policy is happening, but also what they have to do. And you'll need to be able to address creating a data management and sharing plan, as well as perhaps some data management best practices. And this can include asynchronous or synchronous class materials. So we have an example here provided by Melissa Ratajewski from the University of Pittsburgh. who has been providing training across her campus with partners, notably with the Office of Sponsored Programs and their CTSI Responsible Conduct of Research program. And I'll talk a little bit more about partners across the campus in a second. Next is resource creation. So this is creating and collecting and making findable resources, materials, or guidance that can help researchers comply. These resources may include institution-specific guidance on writing a DMSP, as well as materials created by the NIH. And something I like to emphasize here is that there are a lot of different working groups of librarians creating these resources and materials. So before you go and try to make something from scratch, looking at what other folks are doing might be a good place to start. And an example provided by Sarah Samuel at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor is updating and maintaining the NIH page of their research data guide with current information about the policy, recordings of workshops, and other resources, including materials from the grassroots working group on NIH DMSP guidance. This working group was a group of librarians that were connected through MLA, RDAP, and I think maybe some other groups. And they worked together to create materials to help with compliance for this new policy. So Sarah here has worked to help make those resources findable for her institution and done some edits to make it specific to her institution's needs. Now, there's also DMS plan review. Now, this can include reviewing, editing, or providing feedback on data management and sharing plans at the point of grant submission in order to provide guidance on data management and sharing best practices. Now, this may require significant resources depending on the number of researchers who request this service. So we don't have an example of this yet. I know there are institutions that are doing this. I will have to talk to them to get some of their specifics about how they are accomplishing this. I will say at NYU Langone Health, we are not doing this in part because of time concerns. But I think it is an area for growth and something that researchers have requested, at least at NYU. And then finally, the creation of machine actionable data management plans. Now, we won't go into this too much today. A machine actionable data management plan is a framework undergoing extensive research and feasibility and implementation. So services like DMP Tool are looking into how to make this idea a possibility. It's basically meant to help automate data management and sharing processes by making the information we enter into data management and sharing plans machine readable. Now, we do have an example of this provided by Levi Dolan at Indiana University. They know that they've been reviewing and updating an in-house institutional system that's used to create data management plans to integrate with APIs within their systems already so that they can tie these DMPs to grant status. So very simply, they're working on ways to tie their existing information about who is funded and who is not to the DMPs that are being entered as a part of grant submission. Now, I've mentioned a few partners that different people are working with throughout all of these types of services. And I just want to note that a lot of times successful institutional support is going to rely on partnering with different departments. Example departments include, of course, the library, but also IT, perhaps legal, the grants office, science and research offices, scientific cores, as well as the IRB. And I've pulled some example tasks here and people that you may partner with for each of these tasks. So when it comes to creating guidance for writing data management and sharing plans, including institution-specific template or suggested language, you might want to work with IT, particularly on tools, software, and/or code. You might work with legal, the library, and IRB. That would be particularly in areas dealing with perhaps human subjects data or limitations on data sharing. You may also work with the scientific cores in the Science and Research Office. Now, acting as consults or contacts for researchers creating data management and sharing plans, you might work with IT, legal, IRB, the library, and scientific cores, depending on the exact nature of the question being asked. In the development of educational materials and possible educational requirements, you might work with the grants office, the Science and Research Office, as well as the library. Deploying technical solutions, IT is clearly going to be key there as a partner to work with. In the development of outreach and communication strategies, working with IT, the Science and Research Office, the Grants Office, and the library would be quite helpful. As I stated earlier, at NYU, we've worked with the Communications Office because they already had workflows in place to telling researchers about new policies and new requirements. So we were able to slot right in there to their pre-existing workflows. And then finally, in ensuring institutional policies do not contradict the new NIH policy, you may end up working with the Grants Office or the Science and Research Office. All right, and now I'm going to hand it off to talk about research data management basics.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Genevieve Milliken and I'm the Data Services Librarian at NYU's Health Sciences Library, and I'm also one of the three content experts at the National Center for Data Services. So really, before we dive into the minutia of the NIH data management and sharing policy, I want to provide an important framing of the policy through the lens of research data management. Of course, I make no assumptions about your background or knowledge of research data management, so we're really going to go over some of the basics. And I really think this is a helpful framing to understand the policy and sort of the impetus behind it a little bit better. And it also will help us to understand the policy itself and talk to researchers. So before we get started, I want to start with a funny but didactic video on why data management is important. Of course, some of you on the call may be familiar with this very viral video, especially if you're in the data librarianship, but it's really helpful to revisit the data management snafu. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to YouTube. The video is about 5 minutes, and then we'll discuss on the other side.
When the stakes are high at work, your tone matters.
Sorry, we do have an
Grammarly's
ad.
advanced tone suggestions can help.
Okay.
Hello. My name is Dr. Judy Benign. I'm an oncologist at NYU School of Medicine.
Hello, Dr. Judy Benign.
I read your article on B-cell function. I think that I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer.
I am not an oncologist.
I know, but I think I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer. Do you have the data?
Everything you need to know is in the article.
No. What I need is the data. Will you share your data?
I am not sure that will be possible.
But your work is in PubMed Central and was funded by NIH.
That is true.
And it was published in Science, which requires that you share your data.
I did publish in Science.
Then I am requesting your data. Can I have a copy of your data?
I am not sure where my data is.
But surely you saved your data.
I did. I saved it on a USB drive.
Where is the USB drive?
It is in a box. It is in a box at home. I just moved.
But can I use your data?
There are many boxes. So many boxes. I forgot to label the boxes.
Hello again. Thank you for sending me a copy of your data on a USB drive. I received the envelope yesterday.
You are welcome, but I will need that back when you are finished. That is my only copy.
I did have a question.
What is your question? You might find the answer in my article.
No. I received the data, but when I opened it up, it was in hexadecimal.
Yes, that is right.
I cannot read hexadecimal.
You asked for my data and I gave it to you. I have done what you asked.
But is there a way to read the hexadecimal?
You will need the program that created the hexadecimal file.
Yes, I will. What is the name of the program?
Cytosynth.
I do not know this program.
It was a very good program. The company that made the program went bankrupt in 2007.
Do you have a copy of the program?
I do not use this program anymore because the company that made it went bankrupt. Maybe you can buy a copy on eBay.
I have good news.
You again.
I talked to my colleague. She knew a person with a copy of the software.
Then why do you need me? Everything you need to know about the data is in the article.
I opened the data and I could not understand it.
If you have the program, you will find it is clear.
Well, I noticed that you called your data fields SAM. Is that an abbreviation?
Yes, it is an abbreviation of my co-author's name. His name is Samuel Lee. We call him Sam.
I see. And what is the content of the field called SAM1?
Ah yes, SAM1 is the level of CXCR4 expression.
And what is the content of the field called SAM2?
That is logical if you think about it.
What is the content of the field called SAM2?
I don't remember.
What about SAM3? Is there a guide to the data anywhere?
Yes, of course. It is the article that is published in Science.
The article does not tell me what the field names mean. Is there any record of what these field names mean?
Yes. My co-author knows what the content of SAM2 is, and SAM3. And SAM4.
Can I talk to your co-author?
I'm not sure.
I would very much like to talk to your co-author.
Well, he was a graduate student. He went back to China 2 years ago.
Can I have his contact information?
He is in China. His name is Sam Lee.
I think I cannot use your data.
You could check the article to see if what you need is there.
Please stop talking now.
Okay, so I really like this video because it shows you some concrete RDM problems, but it also shows you some cultural ones in terms of how people share data, expectations of researchers, and their expectations of one another. So in the chat, can you identify some of the problems that you saw in the video? Yes, so having one copy of the data, oh, they're really coming through. So having one copy of the data, having it stored at home, so is on a USB drive in a box somewhere, no documentation, naming issues, so related to the variables, no naming convention or an unclear naming convention, no standardization, obsolete software is a huge one, no data dictionary, and then using a proprietary program that is also out of date. And a clear reluctance to be helpful. So I think that was what I'm really getting at when I say like these cultural issues about sharing. So ideally something like this policy will help with some of these because there are mechanisms in place for someone to share their data, and those, you're not reliant on somebody or a grad student that may have left. So, I think that's really the heart of the policy, which is very, very good in terms of data sharing and sort of open science in general. So what is data management and why is it important? Oh, sorry. Okay, so data management are the rules and guidelines that you and your team set to manage the organization, collection, storage, preservation, and access of data generated from research. So from this first point, we really see that data management is often a collaborative team effort, and it can include PIs, but also other people, so researchers, data analysts, statisticians, graduate students, data managers, and so on and so forth. But basically, it is also managing your data effectively, and this can only not help your own research to be sound and replicable, but can also help anticipate any problems that occur during the research process. So an important tenet that I like to highlight of research data management revolves around things like quality checks and quality assurance, which can identify problems early on. So normally before and during data collection as opposed to after. So checking for things like quality can help identify any of those issues related to things like accuracy, relevancy, completeness of your data, timeliness, and consistency across your data set. And the second topic that is mentioned in this bullet point is the idea of replicability, which really refers to the ability of a scientific experiment or something like a clinical trial to be repeated to obtain consistent results. So likewise, we also have reproducibility, which refers to instances in which the original researcher's data and computer code are used to generate the results. In my opinion, good data management can contribute to well-described, findable data with clear documentation. So all of the things that you noticed in the chat from the video, hopefully things like data management can ameliorate. So my last bullet point for this slide is really ensuring that you are meeting the requirements set out by research funders and publishers. So we're here at a day-long immersion sessions to talk about a policy. And we also have, other policies from other funders that have stipulations about data management that are really helpful to know. And we also see that only funders but publishers have policies that are coming out related to, publication. So this idea that we're going to really support authors that are transparent in their data sharing. So we see it on both ends, both the funders and the publishers. Okay, so this is a little talk on data management. So let's talk about data. So a very generalized definition are this idea that data is any kind of raw information that we work with in order to learn something new. Some examples may be qualitative data, so surveys and research, or surveys and interviews, numerical data, map and GIS information. So potentially you're working with somebody that's using spatial data or shape files, what have you, as well as lab notebooks and field notebooks, and other types of data related to the medical field or basic science, so sequencing data, microscopy, any type of lab data, as well as medical imaging or graphical information. So just two examples might be MRI data or EKGs. So while this is sort of a very generalized definition, the NIH gives us a very concrete one. So the NIH defines scientific data as data commonly accepted in a scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publication. So I do want to highlight that they use the language of replication. So validate and replicate research findings is really embedded into their definition of scientific data. So scientific data includes any data needed to validate and replicate research findings. Some of the things that it does not take into account, which I think Lisa also mentioned, are things like laboratory notebooks, preliminary analysis, case report forms, drafts of scientific information, future studies, peer reviews in communications, or physical objects. So a lot of these are not easily digitized, and analysis may be a little bit harder. So that's not necessarily considered data in the NIH's view. So regardless of the data type, it is likely that data will go through some type of process. So irrespective of that data, it'll likely go through the research data lifecycle. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this model, but basically it's a heuristic model for understanding the steps of the process of scientific discovery, and this is what we call research. It is often represented as a wheel to emphasize the continuous nature of research with either one stage or one project leading to the next. And the research data lifecycle includes everything from planning how we will collect our data to things like publication and long-term preservation. So some of the general steps include things like planning and design, data collection and curation, analysis, evaluation, sharing and dissemination, and ideally access to reuse. So really thinking about how we can take the research data lifecycle and apply the 6 elements that are related to the policy itself is really helpful to kind of understand the policy in terms of maybe some of the work that we're already doing. So I've just quickly mapped the elements to where they would fall on the research data lifecycle. So we can see like element 1, data type, can be mapped onto the design of our project, as well as of course collecting that data. And then things like data standards, are we using data standards to collect our information, and then related tools and software. So are we using that, or what are we using to collaborate and do analysis on our data? And then element 4 is related to data preservation, access, and associated timelines. And that really can be mapped onto things like evaluation and archiving. And then of course, 5 is access, distribution, or reuse considerations. And we can really think about the stages of the research data lifecycle related to sharing and dissemination. So thinking about data repositories, preprints, publications, things like that. And then at the top, we have element 6, so the oversight of data management and sharing. And I really think that this particular element is present through all stages of the research data lifecycle. As I mentioned, a commitment to research data management will, contribute to the sort of the quality of your research. Okay. So the next part of this presentation, I want to just talk about each of the elements and then one research data management practice that we can apply to it. So I think it's really helpful to think about these in tandem. So I'm just going to go through the 6 elements and hopefully just give you one or two tidbits related to the policy and how you can support it. So of course, the first one is data type. So something that I think it would be helpful is to understand the data types that are being produced at your institution. So this could be patient information, it could be genetic data, gene expression, epigenetic data, bioimaging, what have you. It could also be public health data. It could be surveys or working with the community, and other types of data that are produced in academic institutions or medical centers, or really wherever you work. Another thing to keep in mind is understanding the file types that are associated with the data type. So this could be bioimaging files or sequencing files, so a FASTQ file. And if you're unfamiliar with the data types, it may be helpful to check out something like the data curation primers. So these are really helpful documents that will help you understand and open a particular file type, and it gives you some information as well as the steps to curate a data set if you need to. So there's currently primers, there's a bunch of primers, but they have ones on neuroimaging files, clinical data, GIS, things like that. Another thing that's really helpful is to understand the storage options at your institution. So of course, we don't want things like PHI and Google Drive. So it's really helpful where it's helpful to know the storage options at your institution. It's also helpful to understand file size. So what's the difference between a metabyte, a petabyte, all in between. All right. So element 2 is software. So collaboration with researchers, managing files with version control, data analysis, all of this requires tools, software, and code. And these are used throughout the research data lifecycle. These tools, however, are not only important for a researcher on a project, but also any person that is interested in understanding, reusing, or replicating a study. So in turn, I really think that we can view element 2 as a means of greater secondary use. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend the recordings from the Librarians Building Momentum for Reproducibility, where we can really see the connection between the work that we do in data librarianship, but also how data in code can contribute to reproducibility. So you can check out those videos. They have some on data, but also a few specifically on code and software. So our third element are standards. So we'll be talking a lot about standards later today in the immersion session, but it's really important to understand why we use standards. And an important reason, I think, is interoperability. So interoperability refers to the ways in which data is formatted to allow diverse data sets to be merged or aggregated in a meaningful way, and it also contributes to things like findability and access. So in addition to interoperability, some associated terms to know are things, of course, like metadata standard, metadata schema, and common data elements. So I've included some resources. The first one is fairsharing.org, which is an educational resource for data and metadata standards and how they can be interrelated and sort of how they relate to databases and data policies. There's also the CDE repository. So a CDE is called a common data element. And really this helps researchers share and combine data sets because they're using the same language for questions. So you can think of it as a question in a in a REDCap form or some type of validated instrument, all of those questions are broken up into their individual elements and then can be reused. So what happens is that researchers are now using the same language as one another, but also having the same options for answers. And there's also the bioportal, which is an open repository of biomedical ontologies. So they have information on things like RxNorm, LOINC, MESH, so all of the big biomedical ontologies. So element 4 is related to preservation and access of data. So we're going to talk a lot about this through the course of today, but it is really helpful to understand the different types of repositories that are available to researchers. So the first one are open discipline-specific repositories. So there's repositories on neuroscience, metabolomics, genomics, medical imaging, et cetera. There's also these things called knowledge bases. So potentially you've heard of Wormbase or Flybase, and this is basically data related to worm biology and genomics, as well as Flybase, which is also related to fly genetic data. There's also institutional repositories, so repositories and research associated with a particular institution or university. And then there's the generalist repository, so they accept data no matter the discipline or the type. And I'm sure you maybe heard of Zenodo or Figshare or Dryad, and those are just some examples. What these repositories provide are a lot of things. They provide hostings and hopefully long-term storage, but also a persistent identifier, which will help you share and cite code a bit more efficiently. So the DMP tool guidance of persistent identifiers here gives information about persistent identifiers, but a lot of other information, including data types, file types, and how to organize your data, as well the NIH is selecting a repository. So there are a list of NIH supported repositories, and that list will help you identify an appropriate repository for a researcher. All right, and then number 5, reuse considerations. So just some terms to know, data reuse. Sometimes this is called secondary data analysis, and this is the analysis of existing data collected by other individuals or institutions for some new purpose. There's also controlled access. So potentially you might have to have something called a DUA, a data use agreement. It basically is a legal contract between two entities that allows you to access and use the data. There's also data privacy. So research data, particular when it contains information about human subjects, such as private health information, may have to be anonymized or safeguarded in a very specific way, and such as using best practices for data security, and of course, if any type of restrictions you need to place on that data. Also de-identification. So there is the NLM data scrubber, which will identify information and scrub it out. You can also, in REDCap, you can also add what's called noise. So you can do date shifting, removing identifiers and things like that. So there are mechanisms in place to de-identify data. And of course, informed consent. So this idea of telling potential researchers about the key elements of the research study, what does their involvement mean, and then really how their data is going to be used throughout the research process. So number 6, oversight. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of these elements through the course of today, and the 6th element is oversight. So it's really helpful to think about data stewardship in terms of this particular element. And data stewardship is basically the process that involves data management processes. So it can include effective curation, control, and use of data assets. It can include creating and managing metadata, applying standards, managing data quality and integrity, as well as any additional data governance activities related to data curation. So it's helpful to kind of think of that when we're identifying people to have oversight of our DMSP. All right, so some helpful resources, I hope. So some of the things that I talked to today come from different glossaries and terms. So the DMP tool general guidance is a great example, as well as data terms related to the NIH data management and sharing policy, our own data glossary at the NCDS. And then there's a really helpful grant glossary for librarians. So if you're unfamiliar with some of the lingo that is used related to grants, this is really helpful to give some definitions about it. So just some takeaways. So each element of a DMSP involves some level of research data management. When talking to researchers, it's really helpful to incorporate RDM best practices when considering each element of a DMSP. Open science and reproducible practices will help avoid any type of data snafu. And of course, it is aligned with the new policy, the new NIH DMSP policy.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.